Deep beneath the English Channel, buried in the chalk where no one will ever see it, sits a machine the size of 2 locomotives. Nobody brought it back to the surface. When its digging was finished, its own crew steered it downward, off the line of the tunnel it had just cut, and left it there to be swallowed by concrete and rock. What almost nobody realizes is that it has company. There is a second machine down there, walled up under the same white cliff, and it has been waiting 100 years longer. Over the next half hour, we will follow 11 boring machines from the first cut into the chalk to a handshake 130 feet beneath the sea. We will show you what became of every one of them, and we will give you the death toll, including the number the official record and the men who were there still cannot agree on. This story does not start in 1988. It starts with 200 years of failure. A French engineer named Albert Mathieu drew the first serious plan in 1802. His tunnel would be lit by oil lamps, and out in the middle of the sea, he sketched an artificial island where the horses could be changed. Nothing came of it. Britain and France went back to war within a year, and the drawing became a curiosity. 80 years later, 2 men got much further than a drawing. Colonel Frederick Beaumont and Captain Thomas English were Royal Engineers, and they had built something remarkable. Their boring machine ran on compressed air, roughly 30 feet long, built by Greenwood and Batley of Leeds. It had a rotating head that cut a circular bore just over 7 feet across, and it worked. Starting from a shaft at the foot of Shakespeare Cliff, near Dover, that machine drove out under the water at about half a mile a month. By the time it stopped, it had cut 2,040 yards from Shakespeare Cliff, with another heading nearly 900 yards long driven from Abbott's Cliff. On the French side, they were digging too. Between the 2 coasts, something close to 3.5 kilometers of tunnel already existed under the channel in 1882. Then the War Office looked at a map. If a tunnel could carry trains from France to England, it could carry an army. Sir Garnet Wolseley put that argument in writing, and the argument won. The digging was stopped in May of 1882, and the whole idea was killed by a fear that had nothing to do with engineering. Here is the part that matters for our story. That machine never came out either. When the modern project reached those Victorian workings a century later, the old heading was pumped dry and sealed off behind a concrete bulkhead. The machine is still in there. And when the engineers opened up the 1882 tunnel, they found something none of them expected. The old bore was watertight, bone dry. The rails were still down. The handcarts were still standing where the Victorians had left them when the government told them to stop. 2 machines, buried under the same cliff, a century apart. Only one of them finished the job. There was one more failure in between, and it matters, because a man in it comes back later in this story. In the 1970s, the British and French governments funded a serious attempt. A boring machine went into the ground at Shakespeare Cliff and cut an experimental heading a few hundred yards long. Then, in January of 1975, the British government cancelled the whole thing. Money, politics, and a country in economic trouble. The machine was pulled out, and the hole was left. That abandoned hole would be used again in 1988. In 1986, Britain and France signed the Treaty of Canterbury, and the terms were unusual. There would be no government money. None. Margaret Thatcher's position was that if private industry wanted a tunnel, private industry could pay for it. That decision looks small on paper. It was not. It set up everything that went wrong with the finances 8 years later. The contract went to Transmanche Link, a consortium of 10 construction companies, 5 British, and 5 French. On the British side, Balfour Beatty, Costain, Tarmac, Taylor Woodrow, and Wimpey. On the French side, Bouygues, Dumas, Spy Batignolles, and 2 others. 10 firms, 2 languages, 2 legal systems, 1 hole in the ground. The American who ended up running it, Jack Lemley, said later that the lesson of the whole job was simple. There must be 1 contract, written in 1 language, based on 1 legal system. The Channel Tunnel had none of those things. Before we go under the water, do us one favor. If you are new here, subscribe. We put out machine history like this a few times a week, and nearly everyone watching this is doing it on a television with a remote in their hand, which means they will never click a link. Subscribing is the only way the next one finds you. Now to the machines, because this is where the engineering gets interesting. 11 boring machines cut the Channel Tunnel. Not 1 tunnel, 3. 2 big running tunnels for the trains, each about 27 feet across, and between them a smaller service tunnel, about 18 feet across, which ran ahead of the others as a pilot, and now works as the escape route and the maintenance road. Each of those 3 bores was driven from both coasts at once, which gives you 6 drives and 12 faces. 6 machines went in from the British side. All of them launched from Shakespeare Cliff. 3 drove seaward, out under the water toward the meeting point. 3 drove landward, back toward the portal at Folkestone. 5 went in from the French side, from a shaft at Sangatte. The British machines were designed and built by James Howden and Company of Glasgow, at their works on Scotland Street, with Markham and Company of Chesterfield and the Robbins Company of Kent, Washington, in the joint venture. The French machines came from Kawasaki Heavy Industries and from Robbins. The French named their machines after women. T1 was Brigitte, and she started the French service tunnel on the 28th of February, 1988. Then T2 Europa, T3 Catherine, T4 Virginie, and T5 Pascaline, who was rebuilt and renamed T6 Severine for her final bore. The British machines were not named after anyone. They carried technical designations, and here we have to be straight with you about something. Only one of those British designations survives in the record we can check. B6. That is the machine that came out at the Folkestone end, and we will come back to her, because what happened to B6 is strange. The other 5 had designations too. We could not find them. Not in the published engineering record, not in any archive we could reach. They may well sit in the Institution of Civil Engineers papers from the early 90s, or in what is left of the Howden Company records in Glasgow. But we could not get to them, and we are not going to invent 5 numbers to fill a gap on screen. One more correction while we are here. You will find claims online that the British machines were also named after women, and that one of them was called Harriet. That claim gets copied from site to site. We could not corroborate it in any British or engineering source. There is a real boring machine called Harriet, named after Harriet Tubman, but she dug in Los Angeles decades later. The women's names on this job were French, and the naming competitions people remember from British tunneling came later, on Crossrail and High Speed 2. The numbers are worth sitting with. The British double shield machines cut a bore 27 feet across using 13-inch cutting discs, and drove themselves forward with something in the order of 7,400 tons of thrust. The big French machines ran about 1,200 short tons apiece. Every one was a factory rather than a vehicle. 200 yards long, nose to tail, with the cutting head at the front, the lining erector behind it, the conveyors behind that, and a crew living inside for a 12-hour shift. 2 football fields of machinery, chewing through solid rock at about 4 feet an hour, around the clock, for years. Now the machines were not all the same, and the reason is the rock. The English side got lucky. Under Kent, the tunnel line runs through a layer called chalk marl, and chalk marl is close to a perfect tunneling material. It cuts easily, it holds its own shape once cut, and it barely lets water through. Engineers on the job described it as the ideal medium. That geology let the British use open-faced machines, where the cutting head is exposed and the crew can walk up to it. The French side got the opposite. Their chalk was folded, faulted, and full of water. So the French machines had to be sealed. These were earth pressure balance machines, where the cutting chamber is closed off and the spoil is drawn out through a screw conveyor while the face is held under pressure. The sealed French cutter heads were built to hold back 145 pounds per square inch of water pressure. 10 atmospheres. The French seaward machines hit water almost immediately and had to run closed far earlier than anyone had planned. And that pressure created the worst job on the project. Cutting discs wear out. When they wore out on a French machine with the sea pressing on the face, somebody had to climb into that sealed chamber and change them by hand, breathing compressed air at pressure, then come out slowly through an airlock. We have told you before what compressed air does to a man's body on the Eads Bridge, where the deadliest machine on the job turned out to be the air itself. The French crews knew what they were risking. The physics had not changed in 115 years. Only the decompression tables had. That difference decided the race. And there was a race, whether anyone admitted it or not. The British machines were faster, and it was not close. They were set a minimum target of 1,000 meters a month, which is a little over 3,000 feet, and they beat it repeatedly. Across the job, the British machines averaged roughly 2,860 feet a month. Their best single day was 247.7 feet. Their best week was 1,404 feet. Their best month was 5,640 feet, which is better than a mile of finished tunnel in 30 days, under the sea, through solid rock. Those records were set in 1990, and they have not been beaten since. The men who put up the Empire State Building in 410 days would have understood that arithmetic. It is the same thing. Find the rhythm, protect the rhythm, and let the machine do what it was built to do. Because the British dug faster, the British dug more. The meeting point under the channel is not in the middle. It sits about 14 miles from the English coast and about 10 from the French one. And none of that speed counted for anything without the lining, because a machine can only cut as fast as the crew behind it can hold the hole open. The concrete segments that keep the channel tunnel from closing were cast on the Isle of Grain, out in the Thames estuary, because there was no room to make them at Shakespeare Cliff. The aggregate came by sea from a super quarry at Glensanda on the west coast of Scotland. At full tilt, that factory turned out more than 1,100 segments a day, and over the life of the job, it cast more than 700,000 of them. The British tunnels went up in rings of 8 segments and a quay, each ring about 5 feet wide, erected in the tail of the machine while the head was still cutting. The tunnel you ride through today is not a tube. It is a stack of rings, 700,000 pieces of Scottish granite and concrete, laid one against the next under the sea. But here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. Speed was not the hard part. Aiming was. Think about what these crews were being asked to do. 2 machines, starting on 2 coasts 23 miles apart, in the dark, under the sea, aiming at a single point neither crew could see or survey. On any normal job, you close the loop. You run your survey out and back and check it against itself. Under the English Channel, you cannot, because there is no way to walk your instruments across the water. Everything depended on lasers, on gyro compasses, and on arithmetic that had to account for the curvature of the Earth and the pull of the tides. There was one way to find out whether the sums were right, and that was to keep digging until the machines either met or missed. They also had to see through solid rock. Ahead of every face, the crews drilled probe holes, 300 to 800 feet out in front of the machine, feeling for water and bad ground. Where the chalk was fractured, they pumped grout ahead of the cutting head to glue the rock together before they touched it. The service tunnel ran ahead of the two running tunnels for exactly this reason. If there was something ugly out there, the small tunnel found it first, and the big tunnels went around it. 8 miles offshore, they stopped and did something that still sounds impossible. They hollowed out a cavern. Trains have to be able to cross between tunnels, so the design needed 2 enormous undersea chambers with steel blast doors. The British one is roughly 535 feet long, 69 feet wide, and 50 feet high, with its crown about 115 feet below the seabed. They were the largest undersea caverns ever built at the time. The French one had to be carved in smaller pieces, because the broken rock on their side made a single open arch too dangerous to attempt. The men who worked in them called it the cathedral. Nobody made that name up in a marketing meeting. It was what it felt like to stand in it. Now we have to talk about the men who did not come home. The number you will see almost everywhere is 10. 10 workers killed building the Channel Tunnel, 8 British and 2 French, between 1987 and 1993. That figure is in the encyclopedias. It is on the engineering institution's own website, and we do not think it is right. Go to Samphire Hoe on the Kent coast at the foot of Shakespeare Cliff, and there is a memorial. It is dated 1886 to 1992, and it carries 11 names, 9 British and 2 French, not 10, 11. Here they are, because they should be said out loud. Gary Crosby, Andrew Bernard McKenna, David John Symes, Guy Jolie, Gary Woodward, Keith Lynch, Stephen William Wright, William Robert Cartman, Renee St. George, Charles McCourt, David Griffiths. Andrew McKenna was 19 years old. In January of 1989, he was hit by a locomotive in the Marine Service Tunnel, and he was the first man to die on the British side. 3 weeks later, David Symes, 36, was crushed against the frame of a boring machine by an overhead crane that was moving concrete lining segments. In October, Gary Woodward, 32, was crushed when a boring machine started up suddenly. The health and safety executive prosecuted all 5 British contractors over that one. In January of 1990, Keith Lynch, a grouter, was struck by a railway wagon underground. In April, Stephen Wright was killed by a falling section of pipe near the discharge lagoons. In May, William Cartman, 33 years old, married, 2 children, was crushed by the segment erector on a boring machine. The coroner, in his case, used 3 words: carelessness, neglect, and bad luck. In July, Charles McCourt was electrocuted repairing a 440-volt cable in the Marine Service Tunnel. On the French side, Guy Jolie was 29 when the boring machinery crushed him in August of 1989. René St. George was 56 when he was struck and killed in May of 1990. That is 9 of the 11 names accounted for. The other 2 we cannot account for, and we are going to say so plainly rather than guess. Gary Crosby is listed first on that memorial, before Andrew McKenna, which means he died earliest, and the memorial's start date of 1886 points to the marine survey work before the tunneling ever began. David Griffiths is listed last, after Charles McCourt, which puts his death in 1991 or 1992. We could not find a date, an age, or a cause for either man. If you know, the comments are open, and we will read them. If this is the kind of work you want more of, there is one more way to help. Every documentary we make takes days of research, and you have just watched 2 of those days come back with nothing but a name and a place on a wall. If you are watching on a phone or a computer rather than the television, there is a link in the description where you can leave a small donation. It pays for the next one. If you are in the armchair with the remote, forget it and keep watching. And the argument does not stop at 11. In October of 1990, Transmanche Link's own group safety manager, a man named Alan Sargent, told Construction News that the French death toll was at least 5, while only 2 had ever been officially recorded. He listed them. 2 men swept overboard during coring work in August of 1986. 1 man asphyxiated by heater fumes in a caravan in January of 1987. At least 2 more killed on the roads. If Sargent was right, and he was the man whose job it was to know, then the real total is somewhere near 13, and 3 or 4 of those men are not named anywhere we could find. The reason given at the time was that France and Britain counted construction accidents under different rules. We ran into the same problem at Hoover Dam, where the official count and the real one have never quite matched either. It is a pattern on big jobs, and it is worth naming. The 5 British firms were fined £10,000 each. The unions called that an insult. It is hard to argue with them. By the autumn of 1990, the 2 service tunnel drives were closing on each other, and nobody knew exactly how close. On the 30th of October, a probe went through. Not a machine, not a ceremony. A drill about 2 inches across, pushed out ahead of the face, and suddenly there was a hole between England and France for the first time in 8,000 years. No cameras, just a small hole in the dark, and a crew standing around it, working out what it meant. The real breakthrough was set for the 1st of December, and the 2 men who would make it were picked out of a hat. That is not a figure of speech. There were hundreds of men on each side who wanted it, and rather than pick a favorite, both sides balloted. The British name that came out was Robert Graham Fagg, a boring machine operator from Kent, 42 years old. The French name was Philippe Cosette, 37. Now remember that abandoned attempt from the 1970s. Graham Fagg had worked on it. He had helped assemble the machine that went into Shakespeare Cliff in 1974, and watched the government cancel the job out from under him. 16 years later, his name came out of the hat, and he was standing at the face of the tunnel that finally worked. The last 25 feet were taken out by hand with pneumatic drills, because nobody was going to let a boring machine ruin the moment. At 12 minutes past noon on the 1st of December, 1990, Graham Fagg and Philippe Cosette shook hands through the hole, about 130 feet below the seabed. They passed flags through. The first object to travel from Britain to France by land was a Paddington bear, handed through the gap by somebody with a sense of humor. A commentator on the BBC called Graham Fagg the first man to cross the Channel by land in 8,000 years. And then the surveyors got their answer. After digging almost 23 miles from opposite coasts, with no way to check the survey against itself, the 2 service tunnel drives met with their center lines about 14 inches apart sideways and just over 2 inches out vertically. Across the whole job, the finished tunnel came in about an inch shorter than the calculations said it would. 14 inches, 23 miles apart, in the dark, under the sea, aiming at a point nobody could see. The running tunnels broke through the following year, in May and in June of 1991. And then the crews had a problem, because 11 machines were now sitting under the English Channel with nothing left to dig. Understand the situation they were in. A boring machine does not reverse. It is not a vehicle. It is a factory that eats forward through rock and leaves a finished tunnel behind it, and the tunnel it leaves is exactly its own size. Once a machine has driven 20 miles out under the sea, there is no road home. You cannot back it out. You cannot lift it. The only ways out are to take it apart where it stands and carry the pieces through the tunnel it just made, or to leave it. So the two sides did two different things, and the split says everything about how the job was run. At every meeting under the sea, the French machine was dismantled, taken to pieces, loaded onto the little narrow gauge trains, and hauled back to Sangatte in parts. The British machines were buried. At each meeting point, the British crews steered their machine off the tunnel line, aimed it downward into the chalk, and drove it into the rock below. Then they filled the space around it with concrete and sealed it up. And then they did something that we find, quietly, remarkable. They connected it to the electrical system. Those buried machines were wired in to serve as an electrical earth for the tunnel. They are still doing that job today. Every train that runs from Folkestone to Coquet runs over the top of a machine that dug the ground it is running through. It was not sentiment. It was arithmetic. Dismantling a machine and carrying it out cost more than the steel was worth. So the machines stayed. Which brings us back to B6. B6 was a Howden machine, about 640 short tons, and she was one of the landward machines. She finished her drive at the Folkestone end, where there was a portal and daylight, so B6 came out. Eurotunnel put her on display beside the M20, where she sat for years as a monument to the job, and everyone driving to the coast went past her. In 2004, Eurotunnel put her on eBay. That is not a joke. The last of the Channel Tunnel boring machines was listed on an internet auction site with a starting price and a countdown clock. The bidding went strange. There were fake bids in the millions, which had to be thrown out. The genuine top bid came in at just under £40,000, and then that bidder walked away, because somebody worked out that moving 640 tons of boring machine off a roadside would cost about £250,000. She finally sold for £39,899 to a recycling firm from Thanet called Reclamet. The money went to 3 hospices and a cancer charity. A machine that had cost millions and cut a hole between 2 countries went for less than the price of a car, because nobody could afford to pick it up. If you have got this far, you are the reason this channel exists. So subscribe, because the buried machine turns out to be a recurring problem in this business, and we keep finding new ones. And if this particular story is your kind of thing, we run a second channel called Machinery Vault that is built entirely around it. Lost equipment, buried equipment, machines that got left where they stopped and are still sitting out there. Same research, same approach, different graveyard. Look for Machinery Vault, and you will find it. Now, 2 of the 11 did make it into the daylight. The French kept 1. T4 Virginie stands today on a roundabout near junction 41 of the A16 with a plaque on her. Hommage aux bâtisseurs du tunnel, in honor of the builders of the tunnel. But there is one part of the fleet that did get out, and almost nobody knows about it. To build a tunnel, you need a railway inside the tunnel, and this one had a good one. A narrow gauge line, about 2 feet 11 inches between the rails, running the whole way out under the sea, hauling men and concrete segments out, and spoil back, 6 days a week, for 6 years. The German firm Schoma, out of Diepholz, supplied more than 100 locomotives for it, and it remains one of the defining jobs in that company's history. The Hunslet Engine Company of Leeds built a dozen more little four-wheeled diesels in 1989 and 1990. When the digging ended, those 12 Hunslets were not scrapped, and they were not buried. Shoma took them back, rebuilt them, widened them out to standard gauge, and Eurotunnel put them straight back to work. They are still working. Go to the depot at Cheriton or at Coquel today, and the locomotives shunting stock around the yard are the same machines that hauled the lining out under the channel in 1990. One machine on a roundabout in the daylight, a dozen little diesels still earning their keep, and 2 or 3 of the big ones under the sea in the dark, still carrying current. That is what became of the fleet. Now the tunnel was finished. The money was not. Transmanche Link's original estimate was £4.7 billion. The final cost was somewhere near $9.5 billion. That is the most expensive privately financed construction project in history at the time. And remember, there was no government money in it. The financing came from bank loans and from ordinary people. That last part is the tragedy. Eurotunnel sold shares to the public in December of 1987 at £3.50. It was advertised on television. Ordinary British and French families bought in, a few £100s here and there, because a tunnel to France sounded like a sure thing. By the middle of 1989, the shares were over £11, and everyone felt like a genius. Then the tunnel opened, and the passengers did not come. The forecast for the first full year was 15.9 million passengers on the trains. The actual figure was a little over 2.9 million. Not a miss. A collapse. The traffic modeling had been wrong by a factor of 5, and no amount of engineering excellence could fix an empty train. In 1995, Eurotunnel lost £925 million in a single year and suspended payments on its debt. What followed was years of financial wreckage. In August of 2006, the company went into bankruptcy protection in France. The year after, it was restructured. The creditors wrote off close to half of what they were owed, and the shareholders, the ordinary people who had bought in at £3.50, were left with about 13% of the company. In France, bitter small investors held dinners where they toasted their own gullibility. In 2007, 20 years after the share offer, the Channel Tunnel turned its first ever profit, €1 million. We want to be precise about what failed here. The tunnel did not fail. The tunnel has never failed. It is dry, it is straight, it carries trains under the sea every day, and the concession runs to 2086. The engineering was right. The arithmetic was right down to 14 inches. What failed was a spreadsheet in an office that guessed how many people would want to ride it, and that spreadsheet ruined more lives than the tunnel did. The last thing to say is about the chalk. Every machine had to put its spoil somewhere, and on the British side, that meant roughly 6.4 million cubic yards of chalk marl coming out of Shakespeare Cliff. 60 disposal sites were proposed. What they built instead was a seawall a mile long, and they poured the guts of the tunnel behind it. 74 acres of New England, made out of the hole they dug to leave it. It opened in 1997 as a nature reserve. A retired teacher named Gillian Janaway won the competition to name it, and she called it Samphire Hoe, after a line in King Lear about the men who gathered samphire on these cliffs. Early spider orchids grow there now, on ground that came out from under the sea. The memorial to the 11 men stands there too, on the chalk they died cutting. And underneath all of it, out under the water, the machines are still down there. The Howden machines from 1990, aimed downward into the rock and sealed in concrete, carrying current through the dark. And 100 years above them in time, and a few hundred yards away in space, A Victorian boring machine sits behind a bulkhead in a dry tunnel, with the rails still down and the hand carts still standing, waiting for an order that never came. 2 burials under the same white cliff. One machine stopped by a government that was afraid of what it might let in. One machine left because it was cheaper than bringing it home. Only one of them ever reached France,